Greetings, weary traveler, and welcome to this tranquil corner of history. Before we delve into the severe winters of medieval times, I wish to extend a warm welcome to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled snugly, preparing for rest, or simply seeking to unwind with a calm historical narrative, I am delighted you've decided to join me tonight. If you're willing, I'd be pleased to know your location and the current time. Feel free to share in the comments. It's always wonderful to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here. And if you appreciate this serene, immersive storytelling approach, please consider subscribing to ensure you don't miss the next installment. For now, let the demands of the modern world fade away as we journey back to a distant epoch when winter's icy grasp held far more peril than most of us can imagine. A time when the shift in seasons brought not just inconvenience, but genuine apprehension for survival. Envision yourself in the medieval European countryside. The trees have long since shed their foliage, and the sun hangs low, its feeble rays doing little to warm the biting chill in the air. Frost-kissed fields crunch underfoot as a breeze carries the initial snowflakes. Winter is approaching, and for the people of this age, it signified one thing above all: immense hardship. The cold permeates gradually at first, but it will linger for many months. The land will soon be cloaked in white, rivers and ponds transforming into glistening sheets of ice. In an era devoid of central heating and proper insulation, the promise of warmth remained a distant fantasy for all but the affluent. Yet medieval winters weren't always so unyielding. There was a period when seasons followed a more predictable rhythm, and snowfall was accepted rather than dreaded. Then, a climatic shift began, ushering in what became known as the Little Ice Age. Spanning from the 14th to the 19th centuries, this era brought colder temperatures and harsher winters than anyone recalled. The precise reasons for this shift remain somewhat enigmatic, but its profound impact was felt across the land. Crops failed, livestock perished, and the icy winds intensified. A notable illustration of the Little Ice Age's severity was the Great Frost of 1709. That winter, temperatures plummeted so drastically that rivers and lakes froze solid. In London, the River Thames transformed into a frozen thoroughfare where people set up shops and even lit fires directly on the ice. It was an extraordinary sight, but one that came with a heavy toll. Many succumbed to the cold that year, huddled indoors as the world outside became a frozen expanse. Amidst the widespread suffering, some individuals found a peculiar comfort in the frigid conditions. One such figure was a young Isaac Newton, then a student at the University of Cambridge. When the Great Frost struck, Newton was compelled to return to his family's farm. There, by the warmth of the fire, he found ample time to contemplate the universe's enigmas. It was during this unexpected respite that Newton began to formulate some of his most revolutionary concepts, laying the groundwork for his theories on calculus and optics. Who knows what other brilliant minds might have been ignited by the quiet solitude of a prolonged cold winter. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the bleakest times, the human spirit instinctively seeks out light. However, for the vast majority of medieval people, winter was a season to be endured, not enjoyed. The wealthy could afford thick wool clothing, abundant firewood, and well-stocked larders to see them through the lean months. But for the peasants and serfs, who constituted the bulk of the population, it was a drastically different reality. Imagine waking each morning in a single-room cottage, the air thick with smoke from the flickering fire, your breath misting as you rise from your straw mattress, careful not to disturb your shivering family members, huddled nearby for warmth. The cold infiltrated every crevice, numbing your fingers and toes until they ached. Breakfast, if you were fortunate, might be a meager bowl of porridge or some stale bread. Food from the previous harvest was diminishing, and you knew the extended winter months would only bring greater scarcity. The livestock also suffered, their coats matted with frost as they huddled together in the barn, their breath steaming in the icy air. As the day progressed, you trudged through the snow to gather whatever firewood you could. It was arduous labor, quickly leaving your hands raw and chapped from the cold. Yet you knew that without a fire your family would not survive the night. You thought of your children, their small faces pinched with hunger and cold, and you pressed on. This was the daily existence for so many in medieval times, a ceaseless struggle against the elements, a fight for survival that consumed every waking hour. And yet, even in the face of such adversity, there were moments of fortitude and even gladness to be discovered. The medieval world was intimately connected to nature's rhythms. The passage of seasons was marked not just by weather changes, but by a rich tapestry of customs and festivities. Thus, even in the depths of winter, glimpses of light emerged. One such illumination was the midwinter feast of St. Stephen, observed annually on December 26th. For a brief period, the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society were inverted, with a peasant or serf crowned as the lord of misrule for the day. This fortunate individual would oversee a boisterous celebration filled with food, drink, and revelry, a rare moment of indulgence in an otherwise austere existence. However, perhaps the most enduring symbol of hope in the medieval winter was the simple act of communal gathering. In a world where survival often hinged on the strength of one's community, the bonds of family and friendship gained profound significance. Imagine a small village huddled against the snow, smoke from chimneys mingling with the leaden sky, a sign of life amidst the barren landscape. Inside homes, families crowded around the hearth, sharing stories and their meager provisions. A sense of unity permeated, a shared resolve in the face of hardship. Neighbors trudged through the snow to check on one another, bringing extra firewood or a pot of stew to those in need. In the flickering firelight, faces bore lines of weariness but also a quiet determination. They had survived past winters, and they would survive this one too. And so, the long, cold months progressed, with snow piling higher and ice thickening with each passing day. Yet, even in winter's darkest depths, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. The people of medieval times understood that no matter how severe the season, spring would inevitably return. They keenly watched for its first signs, the subtle lengthening of days, the softening earth beneath the snow. And when the thaw finally began, it was celebrated with a joy and reverence almost unimaginable today. Plough Monday signaled the official end of the winter season, a day when fieldwork could recommence. Ploughs, long idle, were brought out and blessed in elaborate ceremonies, symbolizing life's renewed cycle. As the first furrows cut into the earth, a palpable sense of relief and gratitude filled the air. Life had been arduous, yes, bitterly so at times, but they had endured through winter's long darkness, through hunger, cold, and uncertainty. The people of medieval Europe had clung steadfastly to the promise of spring, and now, as the land began to thaw and green shoots emerged towards the sun, that promise was fulfilled. This level of resilience is difficult to grasp in our modern age of convenience and comfort. The notion of facing such relentless hardship year after year is almost inconceivable. Yet there's a deeply humbling realization in knowing that our ancestors did precisely that. They confronted the brutal realities of their world with remarkable strength and fortitude. They discovered hope in the darkest of times and joy in the simplest things, thereby leaving us a legacy of resilience that echoes through the ages. So the next time you shiver on a cold winter's day, take a moment to recall those who came before. Remember their struggles and triumphs, their sorrows and joys, and above all, the unbreakable human spirit that carried them through even the harshest winters. Because, ultimately, that is perhaps the most profound lesson we can glean from the medieval world. No matter how dark the night or how cold the wind, the promise of spring always awaits just around the corner. And with that, dear listener, we conclude our journey through the brutal winters of medieval Europe. I hope these tales of hardship and resilience have offered a fresh perspective on your own seasonal experiences. May you always find warmth and comfort in the bonds of family and community, just as our ancestors did so long ago. And may the promise of spring illuminate your path through even the chilliest nights. Thank you for joining me in this cozy historical corner. And remember, if you enjoyed our time together tonight, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe and share these stories with a friend. There are many more captivating tales to explore together. But for now, I bid you a fond good night. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams. As winter's severe conditions tightened their icy grip on medieval society, even the most privileged were not exempt from the season's merciless assault. In drafty, rudimentary castles ill-equipped for the harshest months, royal households faced a formidable challenge in fending off the biting cold and adequately supplying the court. The logistics of maintaining a royal residence during winter were nothing short of astonishing. Enormous quantities of firewood needed to be amassed to fuel the roaring hearths that provided the sole source of heat. The kitchen staff worked tirelessly to preserve meats, grains, and vegetables that would sustain the court through the long, lean months when fresh provisions were scarce. Servants diligently attempted to seal every crack and gap to keep out the penetrating chill, but even the most meticulous preparations often proved inadequate against winter's relentless attack. In one particularly chilling account, a medieval queen is said to have tragically succumbed to exposure within her own palace walls. According to chroniclers, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary was discovered frozen in her bed one bitter January morning in 1326, a victim of the very castle intended as her sanctuary. As grim fates like these illustrate, the shadow of death loomed ominously over the medieval world during winter's dark depths. Yet, even amidst such bleakness, the indomitable human spirit persisted and found reasons to rekindle hope. For much of the populace, that faint glimmer came in the form of the Feast of St. Stephen, a cherished midwinter celebration falling on December 26th. This day offered a brief respite from the ceaseless toil and deprivation of peasant life, a rare sanctioned opportunity for revelry and indulgence. Central to the feast was the tradition of misrule, a ceremonial reversal of the normal social order. For this single day, a commoner would be appointed the Lord of Misrule, granted temporary authority to preside over the merriment and issue playful edicts to his superiors. However fleeting, this act of licensed satire provided a crucial outlet for the simmering tensions and resentments fostered by the oppressive feudal hierarchy. The rigid distinctions between lord and vassal blurred for one joyous day, where all could participate as equals in feasting, gaming, and carousing. The sense of community fostered by such celebrations was more than mere diversion, it was a vital survival mechanism. With winter's cruelty threatening to break both body and spirit, the bonds of fellowship and goodwill forged during the Feast of St. Stephen and similar festivities helped sustain the populace through the leanest times. One chronicle from 1377 recounts the poignant tale of two neighboring peasant families whose meager winter stores were exhausted long before spring's arrival. On the verge of perishing from hunger, they pooled their last tattered resources to share a humble meal on the Feast of St. Stephen. That act of generosity and unity gave them the strength to endure the season's remaining hardships. Such acts of compassion formed the very essence of medieval society in winter. When a helping hand extended to a frostbitten traveler or an extra log given to a shivering widow could mean the difference between life and death. The grim, shared purpose of weathering winter's onslaught together shaped a culture of interdependence that defied the era's often ruthless stratification. But even the warmest expressions of conviviality and fellow feeling inevitably waned as winter's relentless misery stretched on interminably. The Feast of St. Stephen was but a small burst of light and levity amidst the frozen darkness, a momentary reprieve before the bleak slog of January, February, and March. As stores dwindled, bellies hungered, and the cold seeped past even the most diligently stoked hearths, the faint promise of distant spring seemed to fade into impossibility. And yet, year after arduous year, medieval society endured against all odds. Through unimaginable adversity and hardship, they clung to existence, upheld by the grit, fortitude, and fellowship forged in winter's unsparing crucible. As the land lay dormant and the sun retreated, they somehow found within themselves the tenacity to persevere. One can only imagine the surge of profound relief and joy that greeted the first tentative signs of winter's passing. The slight softening of the frigid air, the incremental lengthening of daylight, the hopeful drip of icicles yielding to the sun's strengthening rays. After months of unremitting struggle, the sight of the season's initial defeats against the forces of light and life must have seemed nothing short of miraculous. For the battle-weary tillers of the earth, no day was more welcome than Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year. Falling on the first Monday after Epiphany in early January, it heralded the ground's imminent thawing and reawakening. Although winter's deepest rigors had yet to fully release their stranglehold, the ritual preparations of Plough Monday offered a tangible symbol of hope, an assurance of winter's inevitable loosening and spring's return. One can envision a mosaic of furrowed fields slowly emerging from the receding snows and frosts, the newly harnessed draft teams leaning into the first tentative overturning of the frigid earth. With each sod overturned to greet the strengthening sun, Medieval man dealt another blow to winter's retreating dominion and proclaimed his stubborn persistence in the face of nature's whims. We, in the modern world, with our central heating and electric blankets, our well-stocked pantries and resilient infrastructure, can scarcely comprehend the immense fortitude required to endure the unrelenting brutality of a medieval winter. If the season's impositions seem daunting to us now, from the cozy remove of our temperature-controlled environments, how incomprehensible must true winter suffering be? And yet, when we grumble about the minor inconveniences of a delayed flight or a rain-snarled commute, perhaps we would do well to reflect on the unyielding misery experienced by our forebears during those interminable, frozen months. What reserves of resilience and tenacity they were forced to draw upon year after arduous year simply to survive. Their ability to carve out moments of celebration and fellowship amidst such unrelenting deprivation seems almost superhuman to modern sensibilities. That they not only withstood winter's ravages but managed to find slivers of light in the all-encompassing darkness is a testament to the indomitable spirit that slumbers within us all, waiting to be roused by hardship's clarion call. So the next time we feel our modern discontents beginning to chafe, perhaps we would do well to cast our minds back to the icy plights of our predecessors. In remembrance of those who came before, let us embrace the opportunity to tap into our own dormant reserves of grit and forbearance. And as we nestle gratefully into our warm beds, let us spare a thought for all those who battled winter's bitter siege, armed only with the weapons of will, fellowship, and undying hope. As the new year dawned and Plough Monday festivities faded into memory, medieval life settled back into its familiar winter rhythm. Short, frigid days and long, frosty nights were the hallmarks of the season. The fortunate retreated to the meager warmth of smoky hovels and drafty manors. For the less privileged, winter meant a constant battle against the elements simply to survive. One of the greatest winter hardships was the ever-present threat of sickness. In the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of the time, disease could spread like wildfire. The common cold was an uncommon misery, leaving sufferers red-nosed and bleary-eyed, but far more serious illnesses also stalked the populace. Influenza was a fearsome foe, striking down young and old alike with its telltale fever, chills, and aches. In an age without vaccines or effective treatments, flu outbreaks could decimate entire communities. The winter of 1557 was particularly brutal, with a virulent strain of influenza raging across Europe. In Paris alone, over 10,000 souls perished. Pneumonia was another stealthy killer, preying on those weakened by hunger or other illnesses. The winter dampness seeped into the lungs, causing them to fill with fluid, until the victim essentially drowned. Crowded living spaces provided the perfect breeding ground for pneumonia to run rampant. It was not unusual for multiple members of the same family to succumb, leaving orphaned children and shattered lives in its wake. Even royalty was not spared the ravages of winter sickness. In fact, disease often spread even more rapidly in castles and courts due to the constant flow of people in and out. A visiting dignitary or pilgrim might unknowingly bring pestilence along with their entourage. Henry VIII lost his beloved wife Jane Seymour to postnatal complications, likely exacerbated by the poor hygienic practices of the age. Children were perhaps the most vulnerable of all. Harsh weather, meager rations, and unsanitary conditions combined to make winter a truly dangerous time for the young. Infants born in the cold months faced an especially precarious start to life. In London in the 1500s, fully half of all children did not survive to see their 5th birthday. One poignant practice of the age speaks volumes. The custom of bone lace involved tying a black ribbon to the hand of a seriously ill infant. Should the child pass away, this ribbon could then be used to secure their burial shroud, a somber reminder of winter's deadly toll on the most innocent. With danger lurking both outside and within the home, winter was a time to batten down the hatches and pray for survival. For those of limited means, even the basic comforts of shelter, food, and warmth could not be taken for granted. The icy grip of winter poverty was relentless and pitiless. Firewood was a precious commodity, with strict laws governing the gathering of fallen timbers from forests. A peasant family might huddle around a makeshift fire of dried dung and straw, striving to eke out some feeble warmth. Shivering livestock shared what heat there was, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Food supplies dwindled to a meager subsistence of salted meat, dried peas, and coarse bread. The autumn harvest bounty was a distant memory, and the first shy greenery of spring was still months away. Foraging for winter nutrients meant scouring the stark landscape for hardy fare like nettles, garlic, and mushrooms. The scarcity of fresh vegetables in winter made for some very dreary dinner pots. A typical pottage might contain peas, beans, salted pork, and, if lucky, some foraged greens and wild onions for flavor. Tasteless and tedious, but enough to keep body and soul together until spring. For many, even this unappealing monotony was an unattainable luxury. Storms, droughts, pests, and other calamities could obliterate food stores, plunging entire regions into crisis. The Great Famine of 1315 was a particularly harrowing time, caused by relentlessly heavy rains that rotted crops in the fields across northern Europe. Contemporary accounts paint a chilling picture of desperate people reduced to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh in their hunger. Parents were said to have smothered their starving children as an act of mercy. Corpses littered the streets and fields, too numerous for proper burial. Although this famine was remarkable for its severity and scale, localized crop failures and food shortages were an ever-present menace. A medieval winter diet walked a tightrope between subsistence and starvation. It was a time of hunkering down, with the knowledge that things would likely worsen before they improved. Beyond basic survival, winter affected every facet of medieval culture. Leisure, religious worship, and even crime and punishment took on the unmistakable stamp of the season. The sheer drudgery of eking out an existence in the bitter cold colored all aspects of life. Socially, winter was a time of drawing inward and relying on the bonds of family and community. The cheery gatherings around the Yule log gave way to more sedate pursuits. With travel treacherous and daylight scarce, people looked inward for amusement and enrichment during the long, dark evenings. Storytelling and singing songs helped to pass the hours. The flickering light of rushlights or tallow candles illuminated scenes of sewing, weaving, and whittling, with idle hands seen as the devil's playground. Industriousness was more necessity than virtue. Winter's confinement at least provided ample time for such productive activities. For the literate, winter offered a chance to curl up with a good book, although this was a rather exclusive club. In England, at the close of the 15th century, a humble tradesman's library might boast a Bible, a book of hours, and perhaps some merry jests or tales of Robin Hood. Only the wealthy could afford the lavishly illuminated volumes so prized by bibliophiles. Those who could read often did so aloud for the benefit and entertainment of the entire household. Winter was a time for sharing treasured stories of brave knights, cunning tricksters, and star-crossed lovers. The chivalric adventures of King Arthur and his court were perennial favorites, their intricate plots and noble themes helping to transport listeners far beyond the close confines of their winter refuge. Less wholesome entertainments also served to liven up the tedium of winter days. Gambling with dice was a popular pastime, often leading to heated tempers and empty purses. The clatter of knucklebones and the rattle of dice would echo in many a tavern and great hall as fortunes were won and lost. Drink was another common winter diversion, the fermented comforts of ale, mead, and wine helping to boost both body temperature and spirits. Public houses saw a roaring trade, offering fellowship, entertainment, and an escape from the bitter cold. Inebriation often led to looser tongues and lower inhibitions, sparking lively debates, bawdy songs, and occasionally a brawl or two. The short, dark days of winter also lent themselves to quiet reflection and spiritual contemplation. The church held great sway in the medieval mind, and winter was a time for drawing closer to God. With agricultural work at a lull, more time could be devoted to prayer, penance, and good works. The traditional nativity plays and pageants of Christmastide gave way to more somber devotions as winter deepened. The pious might undertake pilgrimages to holy sites, braving the harsh conditions as a sign of their commitment and devotion. Others spent hours in hushed churches, fingering rosary beads, numb with cold, and meditating on their eternal soul. Charity was also an important winter value, with almsgiving seen as a Christian duty. The 7 acts of corporal mercy laid out a blueprint for generosity, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting prisoners, comforting the sick, and burying the dead. In a season of scarcity and hardship, small gestures of human kindness could make all the difference. Of course, winter's harshness sometimes brought out the worst in human nature as well. Crime tended to rise as desperation set in, and opportunities for theft increased. With people spending more time indoors in close quarters, tempers often frayed, leading to a spike in assaults and other violent crimes. The medieval justice system was ill-equipped to deal with this seasonal surge in lawlessness. Trials were often delayed until the weather improved, leaving the accused to languish in dank and overcrowded jails. Punishments could be harsh, with fines, floggings, and even executions meted out to those found guilty. But even in the face of winter's bleak realities, the indomitable human spirit endured. People found small joys and moments of levity where they could. The distant promise of spring sustained them through the darkest and coldest nights. The lengthening days of February brought a welcome reprieve with the feast of St. Valentine on the 14th. This ancient pagan fertility rite, Christianized into a celebration of love, was enthusiastically embraced by the people of the Middle Ages. It was a bright spot of warmth and tenderness in the very heart of winter's depths. The custom of drawing names for Valentine sweethearts was well established by the 15th century. Eligible ladies and lads would gather to draw slips of paper from a bowl, sealing their romantic fate for the next year. These annual pairings often led to merry flirtations, and sometimes even marriages. Flowers, sweets, and sentimental verses were common tokens of affection exchanged between Valentine sweethearts. The simple act of receiving a handmade card from an admirer could set hearts aflutter even in the chilliest weather. Winter, for all its woes, could not freeze the fires of love. As the feast of St. Valentine transitioned into Lent, the austerities of the season intensified, but there was a sense that the worst was now behind them, and brighter days lay ahead. The snowdrops and crocuses, pushing their fragile heads through the frost, offered tangible evidence that winter's icy reign was finally weakening. Throughout the Middle Ages, the relentless cycle of the seasons shaped every aspect of life, and no season left its mark more firmly than winter. It was a time of privation and hardship, when mere survival was an achievement, and yet it was also a time of resilience and quiet fortitude in the face of the harshest elements. Medieval winter was a test of the human spirit, a proving ground for the values of faith, family, and community. The glistening icicles, frosty meadows, and fallow fields may have presented a picturesque scene, but the realities of the season were anything but idyllic. However, this crucible of snow, ice, and want also forged a people of remarkable grit and endurance. The Middle Ages were built on the backs of those who could weather the very worst that winter had to offer, and still find reason to hope for spring. There is perhaps no greater tribute to their stubborn vitality. So the next time you find yourself lamenting a delayed train or a slushy sidewalk, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Unequipped with thermal socks, central heating, or weather apps, they faced each winter as a battle to be fought with every resource at their disposal, and they emerged victorious, spring after spring. We are the heirs and beneficiaries of their tenacity and unbreakable spirit. And with that, I will leave you to your warm bed and electric blanket, secure in the knowledge that winter has been largely tamed, thanks in no small part to those who came before and showed us how it's done. May your dreams be of gentle snowfalls and toasty hearths, and may you awaken to a world where winter is more friend than foe. As the weak winter sun struggled to penetrate the leaden gray clouds, the people of medieval Europe shivered, pulling their meager cloaks tighter around their shoulders. Winter's icy tendrils seemed to permeate their very bones, chilling them to the core. For the poorest peasants, the cruel irony was that their ragged woolen garments, oppressively hot and sticky during summer's labors, now offered little more warmth than a flimsy veil against winter's biting onslaught. They huddled together in their hovels, grateful for the meager heat from a smoky fire, their breath misting in the chilly air. Animals also felt winter's bite. The elderly draft horse, ribs protruding beneath its shaggy coat, wistfully dreamt of the long-gone lush summer grass as it ate its meager portion of hay. The milk cow lowed mournfully, its teats chapped and raw in the frigid drafts that penetrated the barn walls. Even the wary barn cats looked less aloof, their usual disdain blunted by gnawing hunger and the frost on their whiskers. Indeed, winter was an especially trying time for the lowest echelons of medieval society. But even the nobility, cocooned in their grand, drafty castles, were far from immune to the season's deprivations. Many a noble maiden wailed in despair as her priceless silk gowns proved useless against the damp chill of stone walls. The castle kitchen struggled to concoct enough piping hot delicacies to warm the noble interiors. It is said that King Henry II of England, struck by a severe case of the winter shivers, once burned an entire chair just to warm his royal posterior for a blessed moment or two. His servants despaired, knowing His Majesty's temper was liable to ignite even faster than the furniture if he remained uncomfortably cold for long. But for peasant and king alike, winter seemed to drag on interminably, an unrelenting slog of frozen misery. The only respite came from the occasional celebration or feast day, brief islands of revelry in the dark ocean of winter. The people seized upon these moments of light and levity, cherishing them like a drowning man gasping for air. And yet, even in the bleakest depths of winter, there were quiet acts of courage and compassion that melted the frost from even the most careworn hearts. Neighbors shared scarce provisions with those even less fortunate, exhibiting a generosity of spirit that no cold could diminish. A certain Dame Matilda of York was said to have once given her only cloak to a poor beggar woman shivering herself through the long walk home. When questioned why she would relinquish her sole defense against the brutal cold, she simply smiled serenely and said, "The warmth of human kindness is a fire that never goes out." Such selflessness, such nobility of spirit, was the secret weapon with which the medieval people armed themselves against winter's relentless battery. For though winter could freeze their fingers and toes, it could not touch the invincible summer that reigned eternal in their hearts. And so they endured, they persisted, they triumphed in their own way over the harshest of seasons. The first green buds of spring were more than just a welcome sight. They were a living testament to the tenacity of the human will, the indomitable spirit that could outlast any winter, no matter how dark or cold. As we snuggled deeper under our cozy electric blankets, perhaps we would do well to remember the trials and triumphs of our medieval forebears. For in their unending battle against the elements, in their stubborn refusal to bow before nature's capricious fury, they forged a legacy of resilience that warms us still today. The chill winds of winter may still moan outside our windows, but we can draw strength from the knowledge that if they could brave the brutal cold with nothing but a cloak and their unquenchable human spirit, then surely we can survive until spring arrives once more. Spring at last. As the icy grip of winter finally began to loosen, medieval folk eagerly awaited the return of fairer weather. They had endured months of bitter cold, huddled in cramped quarters, stomachs growling from meager winter rations. But now, as the sun lingered a bit longer in the sky each day, glinting off the melting snow, there was cause for celebration across the land. People emerged from their winter cocoons, blinking in the bright spring light, like bears stumbling out from hibernation. Children burst out of their homes, delighting in the feel of fresh breezes on their faces instead of the stinging bite of winter wind. With giddy laughter they ran through the squelching mud, marveling at the first brave crocuses pushing their petals through the thawing ground. In the fields, farmers eagerly awaited Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year, occurring on the first Monday after Epiphany. It marked the moment when the ground had softened enough for plowing to begin. Draft horses and oxen would be hitched to plows and paraded through the village streets, adorned with garlands and brightly colored ribbons. Church bells pealed joyously as the procession passed, a festive beginning to the growing season ahead. There was a palpable sense of relief as chimneys puffed with smoke once more, no longer choked with snow and ice. The threat of frostbite and illness receded along with the snowbanks. Faces creased with care from the stresses of winter survival now crinkled into hopeful smiles. Soon, vibrant spring and summer produce would replace the bland, preserved grains and hard cheese that had barely sustained them through the long, dark months. It's perhaps difficult for us to imagine, from our modern vantage point, just how momentous this seasonal shift was. We may grumble about slushy roadways or groan at losing an hour of sleep to daylight-saving time, but for our medieval forebears, the arrival of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant they had weathered winter's brutal assault, staving off starvation and sickness for one more year. The skeletal trees cloaking themselves in green once more was an outward reflection of the inner regrowth and renewal medieval people felt as warmth and light returned. Some of that elation can still be heard echoing through the ages in lively medieval folk tunes and verses that welcome spring's sweet return. One English song jauntily proclaimed, "Loudly sing cuckoo! The seed is growing and the meadow is blooming and the wood is springing up anew. Sing cuckoo!" The sheer irrepressible joy is palpable, spilling out in simple yet evocative rhyme. So let us take a moment to appreciate the immense fortitude, resilience, and zest for life embodied by our medieval ancestors. Through the harshest conditions imaginable, they endured, making it through each winter by sheer grit and the bonds of their communities. And when spring sun and birdsong finally broke winter's oppressive silence, they reveled wholeheartedly, knowing they had once again triumphed over nature's cruelty. As we nestle into our warm beds, perhaps half-heartedly grumbling about the chill outside our windows, we might spare a thought for those long-ago souls, the ones who would heave a sigh of pure relief as the snow gave way to mud, flinging open their shutters and letting the spring air rush in. The ones who met winter's brutality with a tenacity and exuberant will to live that should humble us to this day. Let their strength be a reminder to us when we face our own bleak seasons, literally or metaphorically. If they could emerge from the depths of winter's privation with such unabashed joy, then surely we too can find wellsprings of hope to sustain us. The thaw will come, the sun will return, and we will step out once more into the light, voices joined in a resounding chorus of "Loudly sing cuckoo." The blizzards and bitter frosts continued to torment the land, but medieval folk possessed a stubborn resilience. Even in the darkest depths of winter, they found ways to help each other weather the storm. Neighbors shared what meager food they had, taking turns hosting communal meals. Villages assigned young men to check on elderly widows, bringing them firewood and repairing their ramshackle huts. One such widow was Agnes, an old woman with no family to care for her. Her bones ached fiercely in the cold, and her hands trembled as she tried to kindle a fire to no avail. She had nearly given up hope when there was a knock at her door. It was Tom, a strapping village lad, his cheeks ruddy from the biting wind. He brought not only an armful of logs, but a sack of dried peas and a hunk of salted pork, donated by other villagers. Tears of gratitude streamed down Agnes's wrinkled face as Tom stoked a roaring blaze in her hearth. For the first time in weeks, warmth seeped back into her frail body. Such acts of generosity were common in these lean times. The wealthy and even the nobility were not exempt from compassion. Lady Margaret, wife of the local earl, was known for her charity in winter months. Though her castle larders were well stocked, she insisted on sending wagons of grains and preserved foodstuffs to the poorest peasants in her husband's domain. Some of her highborn peers scoffed at this, viewing the peasantry as hardly better than the livestock. Why waste good food on them, they'd ask. But Lady Margaret held firm to her Christian duty to care for the less fortunate. One particular winter, famine hit the area hard. Lady Margaret worked determinedly to stretch the castle provisions, ordering the cooks to concoct hearty soups and stews to ladle out to the starving poor who came begging at the gates. The kitchen boys grumbled at the extra work, but the cook, a portly fellow named Bernard, shared his mistress's sense of noblesse oblige. He threw himself into the task, bulking out the soup with every last turnip and potato in the cellar. The ravenous peasants gratefully slurped it down, heedless of the gristly bits of mutton floating in the greasy broth. For some, it would be their only meal for days. As winter dragged on, even Lady Margaret's coffers began to run low. She took to quietly selling some of her jewels and finery to buy more supplies from neighboring towns. Her husband, the Earl, chose to look the other way, respecting his wife's piety even as he worried it would leave them vulnerable to lean times themselves. The church, too, played its part in aiding the suffering. Monasteries opened their doors to the poor and infirm, offering them a warm pallet of straw to sleep on and a basic daily meal of bread and ale. Some even ran primitive hospitals to nurse the frostbitten and desperately ill. The monks saw it as their holy duty, a way to emulate the selfless compassion of Christ. Brother William was a young novice, tasked with tending to the sick at his monastery's hospital. Though the sights and smells of disease and decay turned his stomach, he forced himself to ladle broth into the mouths of toothless elders and change the pus-soaked bandages of weeping sores. He prayed fervently for the strength to endure this trial and for God to spare him the worst ravages of winter. For winter was the great equalizer, laying low rich and poor alike with its icy scythe. Certainly, the wealthy could afford thicker woolen hose and luxuries like hot mulled wine, but they still shivered in their drafty manners and worried over their dwindling stores. And death came for them, too, in the form of winter-borne disease. The noblewoman Lady Isabel was heavily pregnant during a particularly vicious cold snap. Sequestered away in her confinement chamber, she had every comfort: a crackling hearth, mounds of furs, and attentive maids to cater to her every need. But contagion has a way of sneaking past even the thickest castle walls. A kitchen girl with a hacking cough brought Lady Isabel a posset of warm milk and herbs. Within days, the expectant mother was burning with fever, her lungs rattling. The child came too soon, a tiny wisp of a thing that never drew breath. By week's end, Lady Isabel too was dead. The king himself was not immune. Henry VI, a pious and gentle soul, fretted endlessly over the suffering of his subjects during the dreadful winter of 1433. The royal physicians prescribed him a tonic of cinnamon and ginger to ward off the cold humors, but still he sank into a deep melancholy, unable to warm his hands even when thrust practically into the roaring hearth. Some whispered it was God's punishment for Henry's weakness as a ruler. In truth, seasonal depression was an affliction that could strike any man, from mightiest king to lowliest serf. As the days slowly began to lengthen and the tightly clenched fist of winter finally started to loosen, people allowed themselves to dream of spring. Soon, they prayed, the land would thaw, and the first tentative buds would appear on the skeletal trees. The great wheel of the farming year could begin to turn once more. In the earliest days of spring, on the first Monday after Epiphany, medieval folks celebrated Plough Monday. This was when the first symbolic furrow would be cut into the frost-spangled earth, a hopeful portent of the crops to come. Village men blackened their faces with soot for luck and paraded through the muddy lanes with their plowshare held high, singing bawdy songs to wake the slumbering soil. Afterward, there was dancing and hearty food and much quaffing of ale. It was a promise, a covenant that the dark days of winter were passing and brighter tomorrows lay ahead. The same eternal cycle played out at all levels of society. In the great halls of dukes and countesses, minstrels struck up a merry tune, and couples leapt into a lively carol dance, flush with the optimism of a new year. The king hosted a lavish feast for his court, the tables heaped with delicacies like roast swan and marchpane sweets. Even the lowly peasant Giles and his brood felt a weight lift from their shoulders as they ventured out to their humble plot, Giles clutching the pouch of precious saved seed that meant a future of full bellies. The wretched widow Agnes, who had been knocking on death's door, found herself stirring a bubbling pot of pottage, humming tunelessly. She had made it through winter's gauntlet to see another spring dawn, praise be to God. Winter was brutal, there was no escaping that fact. It brought with it a host of miseries and hardships, from hunger to bone-chilling cold to the constant specter of death and disease. But it was also a time when the true resilience and communal spirit of medieval people shone through. Staring into the abyss of winter's bleakness, they responded with generosity, with grit, and even with defiant celebration. They understood that winter was an inescapable part of the great cycle of life, and the best way to conquer the cold was to hunker down and endure it together. So as you huddle beneath your cozy duvet, perhaps grumbling about the exorbitant heating bill or scraping a bit of frost from your windshield, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Reflect on how they survived winter after winter in a world before electric blankets, central heating, and grocery deliveries at the click of a button. Though our modern winter woes may seem all-consuming in the moment, they pale in comparison to what medievals faced each year. And perhaps we could learn a lesson from them, that empathy, charity, and an irrepressible hope for spring are the best ways to weather the hardships life throws our way, whether it be a polar vortex or a pandemic. Let us all embrace the coming spring with a full and grateful heart, knowing that, however deep the snow drifts, it will eventually yield to the warming sun. The harshness of winter only makes the blossoming of spring all the sweeter. And so, as a medieval king might say, let us winter bravely so that we may spring eternally. Frost crackles underfoot as you trudge through snowdrifts, breath clouding in the icy air. Icicles glitter in the pale sunlight, hanging from the eaves of wattle and daub huts. The village lies hushed and still, huddled against winter's onslaught. This is what winter looked like for most of our medieval ancestors. Not the cozy scenes we imagine of merry feasts and snug castles, decked with holly and buzzing with music and laughter. No, for the vast majority, winter was a time of bone-chilling cold, gnawing hunger, and grim survival. The specter of winter hunger was never far away. With crops withered and livestock scarce, putting food on the table became a daily battle. Grain stores dwindled, and bitter herbs and shriveled turnips were soon all that stood between a family and starvation. One bitterly cold winter in 1315, a medieval Englishman's harvest fell short by a third due to storms and freezing weather. The desperate serfs were reduced to eating the straw roofs off their huts and boiling the leather from their shoes, all the while still forced to labor for their lofty lords. Malnutrition weakened the body's defenses against winter maladies. The common cold could quickly morph into life-threatening pneumonia or bronchitis. Influenza cut through villages like a scythe, felling young and old alike as they shivered in their shabby shelters. With teeth chattering, medieval folk huddled together against the chill, packing into the relative warmth of shuttered houses. Yet this close-quartered coziness came at a cost. The stale, smoky air, ripe with the odor of unwashed bodies, festering chamber pots, and dirty rushes, was a breeding ground for disease. In one 14th-century Suffolk household, 13 family members, from grandparents to babes in arms, along with their scrawny chickens and mangy dogs, huddled together in a single tiny smokehouse all winter. It's incredible that any emerged alive come spring. Sickness was not the only danger lurking in the long, dark nights. Fires were a constant threat in packed wooden cities and towns. One misdirected spark could swiftly grow into a furious blaze, hungrily devouring tightly clustered buildings and snuffing out lives. The Great Fire of London in 1212 started on a cold November night, quickly raging through the city's cramped lanes while water froze in the pipes. An estimated 3,000 huddled Londoners perished in the flames, and many more were left homeless in winter's icy grip. Travel was especially treacherous in these frigid months. Roads dissolved into muddy quagmires while blizzards obscured the way with blinding flurries. With daylight scarce, travelers risked becoming disoriented and losing their way, stumbling from the path to a frozen grave. In 1311, the English Queen Isabella set out from Canterbury for London. As the winter twilight deepened on the shortened day, her party lost the road and wandered helplessly until the early hours, while the pregnant queen wept profusely in fear and exhaustion. Winter's onslaught was no less punishing for working animals. Horses and oxen grew gaunt and weak on scant winter feed. Their labored breaths smoked in the chill air as they hauled logs and packs through knee-deep snow. Frostbite blackened extremities, and ice-cracked hooves and wheel spokes alike. Yet, even in the bleak depths of winter, medieval people found slivers of light. The Feast of St. Stephen, or Boxing Day as we know it today, was a time of charity and goodwill. Alms boxes in churches overflowed with offerings for the poor, while lords supplied hearty meals to cold and hungry tenants. The Lord of Misrule tradition brought a spark of subversive festivity to the darkest days. A lowly peasant, jester, or deacon would be crowned king and preside over merry revels marked by drunkenness, role reversals, and mischief, a temporary upending of the established order. Despite the privations and dangers medieval winters posed, hope somehow endured, etched in frosty breaths, and no doubt uttered as fervent prayers. Hope that the weak and ailing would survive, that food would last until spring, that light and warmth would conquer the constricting cold once more. So this winter, when you grumble about shoveling the driveway, curse at the thermostat, or get chilled waiting for the bus, spare a thought for those who came before us. Our medieval ancestors faced the Herculean task of surviving winter after winter with few of the comforts we take for granted. Their quiet courage in the face of winter's cruelty is perhaps the greatest lesson they have to teach us. Though we will never know most of their names or stories, we can appreciate the magnitude of their struggles and find inspiration in their endurance that saw them through to brighter days. The bitter frost continued its icy reign, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland that would be picturesque if not for the immense hardship it inflicted on the inhabitants of the land. The snow fell ceaselessly from the ash-gray sky, blanketing the countryside in a suffocating white shroud. Icicles hung like glittering daggers from the eaves of peasant hovels and grand manors alike. The hearth fires that burned day and night offered only a fleeting respite from the penetrating chill. Smoke from the precious flames stung watering eyes and choked lungs in the close, fetid air of wattle and daub huts. Their huddled bodies crammed together for warmth, humans and livestock alike, the pungent aromas of dung and unwashed flesh mingling together into a uniquely medieval winter perfume. For some, however, even this dubious comfort was a luxury they could ill afford. Scant food stores stretched precariously thin, and bellies rumbled with the persistent pangs of hunger. Many of the poorest subsisted on little more than coarse bread and thin gruel, praying they would survive to see the spring. The specter of famine lingered in every home. From lowly serf to high lord, none could escape winter's deadly grasp, not even those who wore crowns. In drafty stone castles that seemed to inhale the cold and exhale an unrelenting damp, rulers shivered beneath mountains of furs. Royal households required vast amounts of firewood and provisions to ride out the long winter months. Woe to the kingdom whose sovereign failed to plan ahead. According to one account, a medieval Bohemian princess perished from the cold in her bedchamber, her demise a chilling reminder that wealth and status offered only partial protection from the elements. But for a peasant family, the loss of a loved one to winter's icy scythe was all too common an occurrence, as cruel as it was predictable. Disease added to the season's prodigious death toll. Agues and fevers spread like wildfire through communities weakened by malnutrition and close quarters. The stale, smoky air of hovels and the ubiquitous filth made the lungs more vulnerable to infection. Medieval physicians, their useless treatments often rooted more in superstition than science, could do little. The roads, treacherous with snowdrifts and black ice, compounded winter's woes. Only the desperate or the foolhardy ventured far from the meager comfort of their homes in the darkest months. Travel for any distance was an ordeal to be undertaken at one's peril. Peddlers' carts remained idle, depriving isolated villages of needed goods. Tithes and taxes went uncollected to the vexation of liege lords and clergy. And woe to the army that had to mount a campaign over snow-choked roads, their supply lines stretched to breaking and fraying in the frigid weather. The winter of 1407 saw one of the Middle Ages' most astonishing military feats born of this brutal necessity for wintry warfare. The redoubtable Welsh rebel leader, Owain Glyndwr, faced off against the superior forces of future King Henry V in the high mountain passes. Glyndwr's men, accustomed to harsh conditions, drew the English into a trap amid the blinding blizzard. Hapless in their heavy armor, the English ranks broke and fled, with many perishing from exposure. Glyndwr's stunning victory, won as much by the winter as by Welsh martial prowess, lives on in legend to this day. The winters of medieval Europe were often marked by devastating famines that claimed countless lives. When the cold lingered and spring planting was delayed, food shortages quickly followed. The infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was sparked by an unusually wet and chilly spring that rotted seedlings in the ground. Successive crop failures over the next 2 years plunged much of the continent into starvation. In England, the price of bread skyrocketed to 20 times the normal cost. The poor resorted to eating grass, roots, even the bark off trees. Desperate bands of scavengers dug up graves to cannibalize the dead. It's estimated 10 to 25% of the population of cities like Ypres and Bruges in modern-day Belgium perished. In the French town of Train, a citizen wrote in his diary that the poor were eating dogs, horses, and other unclean things. The misery was compounded by crime and disease, as malnourished citizens turned to theft and violence to survive. One heart-rending account from the St. Mary's Abbey Chronicles relates the fate of a starving woman imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread. The woman was pregnant and starving, but the baker would give her no bread, so she stole a loaf and was caught. The judges would not pardon her, so she was hanged. As she died, the infant fell from her womb before the eyes of the people. The child lay bloody and screaming on the ground, but no one wanted to touch or rescue it, and the baby soon died where it fell. The famine finally eased in 1318 when the weather turned favorable again and crops began to grow. But the specter of starvation stalked the land every winter, ready to reap a grim harvest at the slightest adversity. For medieval people, winter was always a time of gnawing unease, if not outright terror, as they prayed their meager food stores would last until spring. Malnutrition weakened the populace and left them vulnerable to disease. The close, unsanitary living conditions of winter led to frequent outbreaks of infections like influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia. Respiratory illnesses especially took a heavy toll, spread by coughing in stale, smoky air as people huddled around fires. Something as simple as a winter cold could quickly turn deadly in the Middle Ages. Even the doctors of the era were of little help, relying on dubious treatments like bleeding and purging with laxatives to restore the balance of a patient's humors. The Emperor Charlemagne allegedly died of pleurisy in the bitter winter of 814 after his doctors treated him with poultices and unguents to no avail. Many historians believe the Black Death of the 14th century spread so quickly because malnourished citizens packed together in winter quarters had little resistance to the disease. The 1348 to 1349 outbreak killed a staggering 30 to 60% of Europe's population. One poignant tale comes from Pistoia, Italy, where a man named Sir Luca wrote to his brother Francescino describing the devastation. "I am sick at heart and can barely bring myself to write, for things here go from bad to worse. Many are dead and many more are dying. Shops are closed, taverns deserted. One passes down streets without meeting a soul. Wails of grief echo from houses where death has struck. The stench of rot rises from mass graves. I fear our city may soon be empty of life entirely. I beg you, stay where you are and pray for us unceasingly." As the plague raged, entire villages were wiped out. The suffering was compounded by the trauma of hasty mass burials in frigid ground and sick people expelled to die alone in the snow for fear of contagion. The devastating losses of the Black Death left deep psychological scars and forever altered the medieval world. Winter was an especially dreaded time for the elderly, young children, and expectant mothers. Without the benefits of modern medicine, these vulnerable populations frequently succumbed to cold, disease, or malnourishment. It's estimated that in some medieval societies, up to 20 to 30% of infants died within their first year of life, many during the harsh winter months. Complications of pregnancy and childbirth, exacerbated by poor diet and chilly conditions, claimed the lives of countless mothers and babies. The perils of winter childbirth are illustrated by the sad tale of Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry I of England. In the winter of 1120, Matilda was aboard a ship called the White Ship, sailing from France to England. The ship hit a rock and quickly sank, sending Matilda and hundreds of other passengers into the frigid waters of the English Channel. Matilda nearly escaped drowning by getting into a small rescue boat, but then cried out for her half-brother William, who was still in the water. When the boat rowed back to get William, so many desperate people tried to climb in that it capsized, casting Matilda back into the cold waves. The king's young daughter, pregnant with her first child, perished along with the rest. Her grief-stricken father was said to have fainted dead away at the news and never smiled again for the rest of his life. The very old and very young were always in peril during the bleak winters of the Middle Ages. If they managed to survive disease and starvation, they still might freeze to death in their sleep. The medieval poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight contains a chilling, no pun intended, description of the elderly King Arthur shivering beneath his robes in a drafty castle hall, so cold his teeth chattered as he spoke. Without the insulating ice caps and glaciers we have today, winters in the Middle Ages were accompanied by raging snowstorms and devastating floods. In 1216, King John of England supposedly lost the crown jewels while crossing a marshy area in East Anglia called the Wash. Fleeing enemies in rebellion against his rule, John's baggage train was swallowed up by a surging high tide whipped up by fierce gales. The king allegedly escaped by the skin of his teeth, but his treasure, including priceless jeweled crowns and scepters, disappeared into the churning waters, never to be seen again. John died of dysentery a few days later, a broken man. Some historians believe the loss of the crown jewels was the final blow that sent an ailing John to his grave. Winter storms often meant disaster for coastal communities. battered by hurricane-force winds and massive waves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a terrible flood that struck England in 1099. On St. Martin's Day, the 11th of November, came a great sea flood through the length of this land and overran it so far as no man remembered that it ever did before, and drowned many towns and a countless number of people. Another North Sea flood on January 16, 1219, completely submerged the low-lying Netherlands, killing over 50,000 people. In an era with no early warning systems or emergency shelters, the population was completely at the mercy of the elements. All medieval folk could do was pray for deliverance, as icy floodwaters rose and the wind howled like the very hounds of hell outside their frail homes. Harsh winters also meant an increase in fires as people did whatever they could to keep warm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle again gives a chilling account of a deadly London blaze in 1132. A dreadful fire broke out on London Bridge and spread so rapidly that before it could be extinguished, it burned down a great part of the city, with the principal church of St. Paul and the Cathedral of Canterbury, besides many other churches and houses. The force of the wind and the violence of the flames carried burning rafters and sheets of lead from the roofs an extraordinary distance. With most buildings made of timber and tightly crammed together, it's no wonder medieval cities were such tinderboxes. A stray spark or overturned candle could ignite an unstoppable inferno, especially when gale-force winter winds whipped the flames into a frenzy. People fled through narrow, twisting streets as their homes burned behind them, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. There are countless tragic stories of families separated in the chaos, children trampled, and people trapped and burned alive. Given the limited firefighting technology of the era, often all citizens could do was throw buckets of water or snow on the flames and pray the wind would shift before the entire city burned. The devastation could be near total, leaving thousands homeless and destitute in the dead of winter. But perhaps the greatest danger of medieval winter was something that required no great blizzards, floods, or conflagrations. Sometimes, the simple, inescapable, life-sucking cold was enough. It's hard for us to imagine in our modern world of central heating and thermal fabrics, but the bone-chilling damp and constant dark of winter was an adversary from which there was little defense in the Middle Ages. With only smoky fires and piles of furs to ward off the chill, winter cold sank deep into the bones of medieval people. Arthritis and rheumatism were common afflictions, the pain growing worse with every passing year. Extremities slowly went numb, then black with frostbite. Pneumonia and influenza ran rampant in close quarters. The cold seemed to seep into the very soul, sapping all energy and vitality. The 6th century British monk Gildas paints a grim picture in his work on the ruin of Britain. The nights are long and dark, the days dreary and chill. The air bites with malice, the icy blasts cut to the bone. All is blanketed in snow and frost. It is a time of great suffering for man and beast alike, when all the earth seems dead and frozen, locked in the clutches of a frigid hell. For the elderly, and frail especially, winter was a time of dread, marked by a hopeless feeling that the warmth might never return. People piled on every article of clothing and huddled together for warmth, but still the cold crept in. Fires sputtered and died in the damp, leaving only plumes of acrid smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. Coughs and sniffles,